Okay, welcome everybody to episode 20 already of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. And today we have the good luck of interviewing Fanny Olsthoorn. She's an ecologist and a sustainability expert. And today we'll be doing this interview. Thank you very much, Fanny.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So first off, I would like to start as usual for our viewers to get an idea of who you are. Give us maybe an idea of how you arrived at the present moment.
All right. I'll try to keep it short. Half Hungarian, half Dutch. I was born to a Hungarian mother and a Dutch father. And as a child, we moved quite a bit. So I lived there first, and then in Holland, and then we moved to Hungary, then we moved to Belgium. And then for my studies, I moved around a bit as well. But throughout the years, I always enjoyed being in nature, being outside, being with animals especially. And so that's where my interest started, especially in my grandparents' garden, which was kind of my constant. They lived in Hungary and they were my home, I would say, among all the moving. And they really taught me the values of, or the importance of growing food and how difficult that is and how it is to work with nature. And that's really where it started for me. But then I do think I was a bit radical, especially as a teenager. I really thought, I'd end up on the Greenpeace Rainbow Warrior.
Yeah.
I would have this kind of career. And then when I started to study nature conservation, or even before, actually, I did a course in East Africa with a teacher of mine who was very influential. He was actually an anthropologist like you, and he taught me that it's not that black and white with nature conservation, that it can really be at the detriment of people who are deemed unimportant to certain other people. And so that kind of opened my eyes, and since then I am more interested in the controversies in nature conservation and how we can resolve those, I would say. And I went to do research for 10 years on this subject in different spots, and then I wasn't really sure what the impact of my research is, and so that's why I moved more to corporate, like the sustainability around, less about conservation per se, but it did really influence the way I think today, I think. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot for giving us this short, brief overview over your life.
My understanding of racism is it's a form of hate or a form of discrimination based on skin color or provenance. But I don't know if I'm the best person to define this, because I don't actually personally experience racism.
Yeah. And what have been maybe some of your, how can I put this correctly? Like secondhand experiences, or like when you've been in the presence of racism, what have been some of those where, maybe not exactly the recipient, but you've been, some of the experiences where you've been present?
I think my mother, because she's fully Hungarian, it did affect her family in small ways. We couldn't get an apartment when we moved to Belgium. It was really tough because she has an accent. And so these are really small things. Or of course my friends in the West would stereotype Eastern Europe as this mythical being, and while that is frustrating, I don't think it ever affected any of us deeply, apart from my mother, who still to this day definitely is treated differently because of just the accent she has and because she's not from Holland. But being in the presence of racist incidents, I think, is a constant. It's just with us, people speaking English to you, the Swiss person, and speaking Swiss to me, non-Swiss person, is a small might be seen as a small thing, but it is in the end a form of stereotyping, right? Just not thinking that a white person could be non-Swiss and that, a person of color could be Swiss. I fortunately haven't really been in the presence of racist incidents that involved physical violence or anything like that, probably because I had, despite everything, a very shielded childhood, I would say. We didn't grow up in places where you would really see that sort of thing. I think the most common form of what I would call discrimination or racism, I just see from the lack of diversity of the places that I've lived in, not in Holland, but definitely in other places, or like my workplaces that are predominantly white, especially here in Switzerland. And that is obviously a result of discrimination. There's no way around it. It's very hard for people outside Europe to get a job in Switzerland in the first place.
Okay, thanks for these subtle and yet illuminating examples. Diversity.
I would define diversity as, it's a hard one. I'd say freedom for all beings, maybe. In its simplest form, what are its benefits? I mean, what are not the benefits? I think the benefits are obvious. I mean, respect for all and an ability for all to have hopes and dreams and the right to a decent life. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Given your background in environmental studies, conservation, sustainability, I would also like to look at one more. I'll just call it the force for good, which is climate justice. What is your it's an interesting term, but I really don't know what to make of it. What do you make of climate justice?
I think the term climate justice implies that certain people are more affected by climate change than others. I think that's what's at the base of it. And so certain people who are deemed less important will be much more affected by climate change and will be much less considered. Or the consequences of climate change are being blamed on certain groups of people. So, for example, in conservation, it's very common that there are development projects to help what they love to call local people or local communities live more sustainable lives. And this is really disturbing to me because if you look at the CO2 footprint of average people around the world, we are the ones who, in the West, right, in the proverbial West, are the ones who are the highest consumers. Yet there are no projects to make my life more sustainable. And there are no laws in place that limit my CO2 footprint. None. I can fly as much as I want, I can buy as much meat as I want, I can buy as much crap as I want, and there will be no NGO at my door telling me to limit this for the sake of climate change. Whereas for a lot of people across the globe, this is the reality, right? It'll be like they are reliant on, in Uganda, this was the case, for example, where people live next to a national park where I was working and they had to go into the national park, which obviously they didn't choose that would be a national park, for them it's just their backyard, and they would get wood for fire, and this was then regulated, and they would get medicines, and this was then regulated, and this is uncomfortable to me, right? Or projects where people get electric cookers so that they don't cook on wood, which is how they would do it traditionally. and it's just imposed, and it's getting resources becomes a punishable offense for which you can go to prison. And I've seen in Tanzania people go to prison right in front of my eyes. They were arrested for killing a giraffe, but it's okay for a tourist to do it because they pay a lot of money, and that money is supposed to go into conservation. And this, I think, is really disturbing because we have a classification of who is allowed to, basically white people are allowed to destroy the planet, but people of color aren't. And we are not the ones reliant on those resources as much as the people of color who sometimes, especially in rural settings, are just reliant on certain resources, but that doesn't mean that their CO2 footprint is high. It's actually very, very low compared to us, and I think we question much more those practices than ours.
Thank you very much for making this issue of climate justice much more tangible and clear for a layperson like me. So I think it's still a very important question which came up with an earlier interview, Fatima Murmuni, who said she's tired of always having to talk in the workshops, etc., about racism. So she was experiencing racism fatigue. And I was curious to know if you have any similar feelings about having some sort of sexism fatigue.
No, because that's not my everyday job. I don't work in this sector. If anything, I'd have sustainability fatigue a bit. But for sexism, no, I'm quite in the opposite case. When I became a mother and before, that's why I really understood more about sexism, I think. And I'm super lucky because in Switzerland, I think we do get a lot of respect from doctors and staff who take care of you during pregnancy and after. But still, it just dawned on me how fundamentally different life experience can be for women, for lack of a better term, than for men. And so I understood how much support there is lacking for the experiences to be less difficult for women than for men. And some things are just unerasable, right? The women are the one giving birth, and therefore you will just have to miss some work time, for example. But there could be so much more in place for the experience of becoming a parent to be more similar for men and women. And so what I'm trying to say is I don't have fatigue. I have the opposite. Like, I really got a fire in my belly about this topic when I became a mom, and that's very recent for me. It's only 1.5 years ago, and so it is something I read more about now than ever.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to link back a little bit to your work in sustainabilities and in companies, and the first one is simply how do you, in your opinion, can corporations, middle-sized, big-sized company, kind of fight these different forms of discrimination we were talking about, especially against women? What kind of approaches do you think would be essential?
I think companies can do think, and I think it's important for companies to do think, but I do want to mention before getting into what companies can do that I do think this is a government role to regulate companies to do this. It's okay. It's great that there are some companies at the forefront really fighting for it and going beyond and above the laws that exist to make the work experience more comfortable for, women, people of color, people with disabilities, etc. But in the end, to me, this should be government driven. But companies can definitely do things. So, equal paternity and maternity leave for the case of parenting is, to me, the most fundamental piece.
Yeah.
I think many men get ahead in their careers in this time where women go and give birth and maybe disappear from the work floor for several months or years.
Yeah.
For the issue of having more diversity in different positions, I think quota systems are of the essence. For people of color, people with disabilities, and people with disabilities, and for women, and this is very controversial, I understand that. And individual people who are on those high positions and feel like they deserve to be there can really feel attacked by this and be like, why am I being shoved aside? Why is it? So this government regulation would be the first place, but it's really hard to achieve. And so the second piece of it would, I think, somehow help people get back to understanding that we are part of a whole and that other animals and plants, trees, fungi, they have really intricate lives, even viruses and bacteria, not our favorites, but they all have goals and wishes for their lives, and we are standing in the way of them achieving that, and that's a big deal, I think. And it's something we trivialize, like, oh, these cute animals, and we think their lives are really simple and straightforward, but actually they're really complex. Like, animals deal with really complex issues in their lives, and they are worth our time, and they are worth having a space on the planet. They have worth to decent lives, just like we do, and they have the right to live out their wishes and their desires. And I think in the Western world, we have kind of forgotten about this. We are so far removed from it. We have so protected ourselves from the elements and nature that we don't understand how in everyday life we are completely dependent on all the cycles of nature, on all the little all the processes in nature that in the end lead to the conditions that we can also be alive. How to do that, to me, is the million-dollar question. I know they send like CEOs to like nature immersion camps, and this apparently has some good effects. But yeah, I'm yet to. It's something that keeps me busy. How do we get? How do we help people to understand that they're animals, part of a whole? Yeah. And then, your second part of the question was with discrimination.
How it pervades, how discrimination still pervades the issues of sustainability.
And this is huge, and I think our approach to this, to the climate crisis, is just really upside down because of discrimination. Like, kind of because of the things that I said before. Like, we are very set on improving people's lives who are still backward and reliant on nature, right? Yeah. And that's not where the issue is. The issue is really with rich people having too many freedoms. And so if discrimination wasn't, or racism in fact, or speciesism wasn't a fact, then we wouldn't have this issue in the first place. I think the whole climate crisis, because we are devaluing certain species or certain groups of people, that we are in this mess. Yeah. So discrimination is at the root cause of it, and it's also why I think the solutions that are being offered are insufficient. Yeah.
Thank you for this great shift of viewpoint to give us a different perspective on this entire topic. Then the second to last segment, the penultimate segment, you probably already know. It's our call and response, non-trigger trigger. So I have a few expressions for you. And you can just freestyle what comes to mind. First one, Utrecht.
Freedom.
Greenwashing.
Everywhere.
Cusk.
Cusk.
Yeah.
The best mother on the planet.
Corporate accountability.
Shitty buzzword.
Budapest.
Home.
Conservation.
Invented by white people.
Ivory Tower.
Scientists are not in it.
Working out.
What's the Latin saying? Healthy mind and healthy body.
Yeah. Then Uganda.
So much mystery still, but so much diversity and beauty.
Ticks.
More interesting than you think.
And finally, motherhood.
Oof. It's everything to me.
Thank you very much, Fanny. We come to our really very last segment. The daily, weekly, monthly, yearly practices which you have that you think have a positive impact and move you forward.
This is really interesting because I was just thinking about this today and how it changed. Mm-hmm. I was a very routine person before having a child, and would wake up and meditate and do yoga and all these good things before getting out of the door, and this is now become more challenging. But I think what I keep trying to do, at least, is definitely meditation is a practice that I do daily-ish now. Mm-hmm. Which just helps me to not be so reactive. Yeah. Which is, or to just, get, just spend time in quiet. I think doing things that are deemed unproductive is really an act of resistance these days. Yeah. It's not a side hustle, it's not a... So I try to incorporate more things that... like reading fiction or playing the piano that are not really good for anything, but just fun to do. Practices. Keeping in touch with family is something that remains challenging, but it is something that also keeps me grounded, or with friends, and many of them are far away. What else? Any practices? Noticing things around you, I think, is important when you're walking, whether that's a tree or a person, and trying to understand their perspective, and without too much judgment, even if their opinions are very different or their life form looks completely unrelatable. In the case of animals or trees, just kind of keeping an awareness of other beings, I think, is a good practice, which is not always as easy. It's something I try to come back to.
Thank you. Then there's also the question of recommendations. What books, movies, series would you tell our viewers, hey, if you watch this, good chances it will make you happy or intellectually stimulated?
One is a textbook, which is very strange to say, but there is this textbook, I don't know who it's by actually, but it's Behavioral Ecology, and if you're interested in other beings, I think it's a very good way to start. It's not bobsci or anything, it's really just a textbook, but it really opened my eyes to how interesting other beings' lives are, and how clever and loving or crazy they can be. I think movies from Lars von Trier, although unbelievably depressing, did have some kind of effect on me, because I watched them when I was in my early 20s, and it kind of like just completely changed my view of the world. Shows, I think, Borgen, which I keep on harping about because I think it's a very good representation.
Okay, very last one. Questions, topics that keep coming back to you, that are kind of haunting you, that are on your mind.
Yeah, I think one question for many people is like, what is the difference between my values and my actions? And that's, I think, something that keeps haunting me. Like, I tell myself that I'm a certain type of person, but is that true in real life? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And I guess, yeah, this other question is like, how do I get more understanding for other beings in the world, who, whether people or animals or plants, who have different lives, and how can I guess understand their perspective better. Yeah. How shitty is death going to be? These things. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Have you experienced instances of racism from me specifically, for example?
From who?
From me.
Honestly, not that I can think of.
Or like small or big things. It can be.
I think not, or I couldn't remember. And I think that, so the whole thing which you mentioned earlier about how ambiguous racism is in the mind of the person who experiences it. So you often, not always, but often you have this possibility of attributing different reasons for this. So I think if it ever happened with you in some way, then I would have attributed it to something else, right? I would have attributed it to your mood, or to how I had been behaving that day or that week. I wouldn't have. It wouldn't have been in my mind to say, "Oh, this now is a manifestation of this little subcomponent of your mind that happens to be racist." Yeah, and I think maybe sometimes that can help people to also, to at least in an immediate situation, to kind of deal with it. I'm not saying people obviously should suppress it or anything, but sometimes you can be aware that there are multiple reasons for somebody to seemingly discriminate. Yeah,
makes sense. And do you get racism fatigue from doing this series, for example?
So far, not yet. I haven't experienced it yet, and I think it has to do with the people, with the interviewees, you and the 19 other ones. I always get to do new research on the people, and the interviews themselves are, even though the questions are so heavily repetitive, each interview is so vastly different that makes it, to me, very exciting. And also sometimes we branch out a little, look into little nooks and crannies of people's lives. So though racism is one of the central themes, I don't feel at all like it's boring or exhausting me. I think the places where this might be the case is when it happens in everyday life. If I have the feeling that somebody might discriminate me because of race, then that can be like, again. But in the interviews, not at all.
And when you interview white people, I realized you didn't ask me any question. You asked me if I was witness of instances of racism, but you haven't asked me if I was witness or subject to instances of white privilege.
Yes, I've just really...
Which is nice, but...
Yeah. No, I've just kind of forgotten this. It's interesting that you mentioned this, because the interviews I've had from, especially from India, then I talked to them, asked them about these experiences of racism, then they would often switch to their caste privileges.
Yeah.
Because they were uncomfortable talking about racism because they maybe didn't experience it so often, or it wasn't very dominant in their life, but their caste privilege was always seemed to be very much in the foreground of their thinking and awareness and conscience, which obviously... Hey everybody, unfortunately that was already the end of episode 20 with Fanny Olsthoorn. We were struggling mightily, unfortunately, with the camera, but still it was a great experience. I wanted to thank Fanny, and I wanted to thank you all for watching. And I'll see you again for interview 21 with Melody Chow. Okay, take care, bye bye.